Welcome to this panel on the politics of North Africa. I'm Yezid Sayigh. I'm a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, Lebanon. And with me today, I have a powerful panel of colleagues, including Michele Dunne, head of the Middle East program of Carnegie in Washington, D.C., Frederic Wehrey, senior fellow, also based in D.C., resident scholar Dalia Ghanem, based in Beirut, and Hamza Meddeb, non-resident scholar based in Tunisia. We're going to be discussing the tumultuous year that has just passed in North Africa, where we've got a persisting conflict in Libya that has actually intensified, protests in Algeria, tug of war between Egypt and Ethiopia, recent tensions in the Western Sahara, any of which might threaten the region's stability. The panelists will discuss the implications of these unfolding dynamics and discuss the future of the region's ruling political orders, geopolitical rivalries, as well as the alliances that they expect will shape North Africa in 2021. I'm going to turn immediately to Fred Wehrey to discuss Libya. And it's very clear, it's been made more clear than ever before, that Libya has become an important focal point of regional and international rivalries. And I'm going to go straight to a very simple question, which is, what is the current state of play on the ground?
Thanks, Yezid. There's some cause for both optimism and pessimism. Some remarkable developments over the summer and fall of this year. Briefly stated, there was a massive offensive by the government of national accord, backed by Turkey, that pushed Haftar's forces to the Oil Crescent region. There's a stalemate. There was a truce signed by the two sides in October. The oil blockade has been lifted. You've had some positive steps, some positive momentum with the talks that are ongoing, brokered by the United Nations, specifically on economic reform. And just yesterday, the rival branches of the central bank met for the first time in 5 years, and they agreed to unify the foreign exchange rate. That's an important economic reform step that basically reduces the black market incentives. And it shows we've got some momentum in terms of healing institutional rifts. You've had protests in both the East and the West against government authorities over services and governance. And that shows that people power matters, right? That's sort of the good news. The bad news is there's some alarming signs that the ceasefire is not being implemented in that Oil Crescent region. There are military talks underway, but it's unclear if the representatives really have clout on the ground. You've got elite jockeying, right? You've got vested elite interests. There are people in Libya, elites, that benefit from the frozen status quo, and they don't want to move the political transition forward. You've got the longstanding problem of militias is still very entrenched, especially in Tripoli, militia capture of key government organs. And then very briefly, I'll close on this. One of the stipulations of the UN brokered agreement was the departure of foreign forces from Libya, but the opposite has been occurring, right? You've got a massive military buildup. There are 10 military bases throughout Libya that are occupied by the foreign forces, foreign countries backing each side, and there's no sign that they're going to leave, and that's a huge problem moving forward for Libya's sovereignty.
Thanks. So I had a slightly broader question to put to you about the UN brokered talks and whether they're progressing. You sort of said not very well, or at least with immense dangers looming. And so I can go straight to the bottom line is, are we looking at renewed armed conflict on a major scale? And does that, given who's involved at the moment in terms of regional players and international players, are we looking at a whole new scale of armed conflict?
This has been the longstanding fear with previous agreements. You had the 2015 Morocco agreement, and it failed to tackle, key issues related to the distribution of economic wealth, related to the security sector, the monopolization of force, and these, questions are still very powerful. And so, you can see a reconfiguration of the conflict. My sense is there's an exhaustion among Libyan actors on the ground with fighting. You have the COVID pandemic, but foreign backers, could be readying for another escalation. Again, we have to look at the massive numbers of foreign mercenaries on the ground that give those foreign powers the ability to wage conflict, whether or not the Libyan proxies actually agree to it. And I think that's very alarming. When you look at the numbers of Syrian mercenaries and Wagner mercenaries on both sides, you're looking at a hair trigger situation.
Thanks. Now, I've got a lot to follow up on that. And you've started to map out not just what the regional international players are doing, but also what's happening on the ground among Libyans and the trends there. I want to come back to that, but I'm going to pause for a moment because I'd like to move to Egypt and start also there with asking Michele about the Sisi administration and how secure it is. I want to start to sort of form a picture of where each of these countries is today before then digging down deeper into some of the geopolitical dynamics, as well as what local actors can or should do to change things. And here, of course, in Egypt, we've got an administration that is far more visibly in control. There's a single state power. This is a regime, a political regime that has apparently been consolidating itself since 2014. Where do you see this, Michele, today? How secure is the regime? How deeply anchored and consolidated is it?
Well, Yezid, I would describe Egypt right now as having a kind of brittle stability, which means that things are very much in a there's a feeling of stasis, of not much going on, and yet it could fracture, and that's because President Sisi has consolidated his regime in a way that has narrowed his base over time. Over the 6 years he's been president, 7 years he's been in control, rather than broadened it. And we saw that recently with parliamentary elections that were just held in Egypt, that formal politics have been narrowed down to a very small group, and even lots of parties and individuals who were basically supporters of Sisi might have tried to have some margin of independence in the past. They're just not allowed to participate anymore. The same thing is true in a way of the economy. Egypt, what Egypt really needs is a much broader economy that really allows the private sector to generate jobs for its very large and growing population. And yet that's not what we see happening. What we have seen is Sisi favoring the military role in the economy, allowing the military, and Yezid, you're the expert on this one, to go in and dominate additional sectors of the economy that were once controlled by the private sector. And we see an economic policy that's just based on a few pillars, and ones that I think are not very reliable right now. We on gas, natural gas, but there's a world glut of gas. So Egypt is having to dance very fast so that it can use more of its gas at home, because now the export picture is not looking particularly bright. And on tourism, which we know it will return someday, it always does in Egypt, but it's obviously a dark picture for tourism right now with the pandemic. And on these construction mega projects such as the new capital, these are sort of the bases for growth, but they're not very vigorous, and they're not going to generate jobs and so forth. So what that has meant is for many Egyptians, the economic picture is a bad one. Sisi has taken some very strong austerity measures, which have gotten him the approval of the International Monetary Fund and other international financial institutions. But he's also become very heavily indebted abroad, and bizarrely gone on a massive arms spending spree over the last 5 years, which has political value for him to do that. But it's hard to explain in the face of, the very tight fiscal situation inside of Egypt, and the fact that Egypt at the same time has engaged in massive borrowing. The state has, both domestically and internationally. And I think the economic situation is a real vulnerability for this regime. And we have seen a couple of instances of economically based protests breaking out, despite the fact that there's a very high cost for any kind of protest right now in Egypt because of the very strong repression and frankly, unprecedented level of human rights abuses.
Thanks. So I'd like to take that a little bit further with you. So what you're saying is there's a high level of consolidation, centralization politically, but in a way that you described as brittle. And I guess what I'd like to tease out some more with you is it brittle because of the economic vulnerabilities you've been describing, or is it that the regime lacks certain kinds of domestic political alliances that would make it more resilient? But linked to that then is, you've said very clearly that you think these economic challenges that are underlying the sort of very rosy headline picture, that these could pose social and political challenges, but there don't seem to be the political actors in Egypt who can turn that into an agenda for action, whether peaceful or otherwise. And so what I guess I'm inviting you to do is to tell us a little bit more about the balance of politics internally, but also how economics might bleed back into the politics, or do we just foresee that there'll be sort of spontaneous protests or riots here and there, as there have been in Egypt ever since the 1970s, which ultimately don't go anywhere politically because there's no one to organize them and direct them in this sort of political vacuum. So, there's a bit more to tease out there.
Economically, and this is related to domestic politics, this is where Sisi, I think, has not broadened the base of his regime the way, for example, former President Mubarak did. Mubarak had a large base of civilian support outside the military and the security apparatus, through the National Democratic Party, through the landowning families of Egypt. There was a vast patronage machine that was a support for the regime, out in the population. Sisi does not have that to the same extent. There is now this, future of the nation, political bloc, and so forth. But we're not seeing the same kind of domestic political organization, and importantly, the same kind of distribution of economic benefits and patronage to a wider circle of Egyptians, the way we saw under Mubarak. So that's a way. The economic benefits, I think, in the Sisi regime are much more narrowly concentrated, and especially within parts of the military itself. Now, in terms of what could happen to threaten stability, as you say, it's correct. No political dissent is allowed. We saw that very clearly with the Coalition of Hope, a group of peaceful, secular politicians and business people who tried to form last year with the idea of running in the parliamentary elections, totally legal and peaceful activity. It was absolutely crushed, and they were all imprisoned. And we've seen that kind of thing repeatedly. So, any dissent is crushed at the source. But nonetheless, I want to point out that in 2018, when Sisi had to run for president again, there was a very notable outbreak of what I would call elite dissent. Several one current and two former high-ranking military officers, as well as a couple of very prominent civilians, stood up and said they wanted to run against Sisi and criticized him. That was remarkable. And they all paid a price for that. Some of them are still imprisoned. And then in 2019, we saw a fairly large outbreak of public dissent, totally chaotic, economically based, anti-corruption protest against Sisi. More than 4,000 people were arrested. We saw another outbreak this year, probably not as large, although it's extremely difficult to know because the Egyptian media doesn't cover these things. This year, again, it was an economically based protest. So, I don't know, what I would say is, should there be a large outbreak of protest, or should there be a coup or some other elite way of removing Sisi, people would look back and follow the breadcrumb trail and say, oh, yes, we saw the signs of this coming. But it's, of course, it's very, very difficult to predict what will happen. I'm just saying that despite the level of repression, it is possible, and we do see these very surprising outbreaks of either elite or popular dissent against Sisi cropping up from time to time.
Thanks, Michele. Egypt is often compared with Tunisia. They were the two first Arab Spring countries. In both cases, the position of the armed forces was crucial in determining the fate of the former presidents for life. In both cases, the armed forces effectively supported in one way or the other the ouster of the two presidents. But from there on, the armed forces took very different roles in the transitional processes. And of course, ever since then, Tunisia has been held up as the pretty positive example of where the Arab Spring succeeded in bringing about a new kind of pluralist politics and a peaceful transition that has been maintained despite a lot of challenges. Now, this is the good news. Tunisia clearly continues to face very serious challenges, and it is really time to dig down into some of those. But I'm going to start with that idea that 10 years later, Tunisia's transition is somehow held up. How do you assess it, Hamza, Meddeb?
Thanks, Yezid. Actually, yes. I mean, it's clear. I mean, that 10 years after the removal of the dictatorship, actually the democracy in Tunisia is under strain, especially with high levels of protest movements and popular contestation, with also serious and major social and economic challenges the country, is facing today, and the government is facing today. So it's clear that this is really, a big challenge, or a big. Tunisia's democracy is under a big pressure, if I would say. As you mentioned, Tunisia had made a lot of progress on the political and democratic side. With the organization of elections, whether general, presidential, parliamentary, or even municipal elections in 2018, the countries and the elites, political elites, managed to compromise and to find the middle ground at some point, to stick to sort of or to adopt a sort of transactional politics, consensus politics, avoiding, of course, this polarization that we have we saw in other countries, and especially in Egypt, as you mentioned. Now, the big challenge actually is that what is really missing at some point is this incapacity of the post-2011 governments to address the social and economic issues, the expectations of people. Those expectations were, and let's recall it, at the beginning of the Arab Spring and of the unrest in 2011, and of course, those unmet expectations are, and this incapacity of the government, of the governments actually, is is feeding sort of discontent, is feeding also sort of a lack of trust and endangering the trust even in democracy and in the democratic institutions. So this is basically the situation in Tunisia. Actually, it's 10 years later. There is still hope, but there are a lot of challenges. And actually, it's time for the economics at some point. Here, I mean, many elites have been debating, struggling, and even going into conflicts over identity issues. But now there is a common, at some point, common perception that it's time for the economy that could not and we cannot really delay anymore these crucial social and economic reforms.
I mean, you've set the stage perfectly for where I wanted to go next with this. You mentioned the disappointment of social and economic expectations, and you've linked that to the transitional process. And it's remarkable and admirable, of course, that key elements of the democratic process, starting with elections, but then deeper aspects of that, have been maintained. The principle of dialogue and of peaceful dialogue has been maintained. These are crucial issues. But at the same time, there's a risk, isn't there, that of overburdening these aspects and making them always be sufficient to keep things going along when such deep social and economic challenges have not yet been adequately addressed. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to put to you is that one criticism I've seen directed at pretty much every government Tunisia has had since 2011 is the failure to develop programs, concrete programs and policies addressing specific social and economic issues, investment, productivity, growth, disparities between South and North, rural and urban, the interior and the coast. And that every government that comes in, and then the next one that comes along, it's the same set of challenges and problems. So how do you explain that? And of course, some of these issues led to, for instance, Tunisia being the largest exporter of disappointed young youths who went off to Syria to fight, as jihadists. An extraordinary contrast, again, with Tunisia's secular and democratic success in some respects. So how do you explain that there was such a body of, disappointed expectation that led to the first Arab Spring in protest in the first place in 2010 and 11. And yet, despite the failure to address those expectations, somehow the political process has continued. So that's a part of the question. The other part is, you ended very nicely saying, now there's an understanding that there has to be a focus on the economy. Why should this be any more successful? I mean, there are clearly very real obstacles, political, but also, vested interest groups. That resist change for one reason or another. Why should we expect that's going to be any different now?
I mean, you perfectly described the situation, Yezid. I mean, it was clear that the Tunisian elites, they succeeded at some point in establishing a sort of power-sharing agreement in 2013 through this national dialogue, facilitated and mediated by national organizations. Now, when it comes to the economic issues, there is a need for a wealth sharing agreement, and this is really lacking today in Tunisia. And I do think that, I mean, it's maybe we keep saying here in Tunisia that it's easier for people to make concession on ideology, maybe on identity issues. But when it comes to interests, it's more difficult actually. And this is one of the major obstacles. You mentioned the vested interest, and I would mention also, I mean, the labor union, the business unions, the corporations in the country. So Tunisian elites and political elites and governments, they have today to manage all these veto groups. These groups who have veto power over all decisions, economic and social decisions that could eventually hurt their constituency. The UGTT is a major player in Tunisia, of course. It is, I mean, representing the state-dependent middle classes, and especially with today with the need for reforming the state-owned companies, the over-bloated public sector, with the inflation of the public sector wage bill as well. There is a need to open a frank dialogue and to get really concessions from the UGTT. But it's the same as well, and this is the case with economic elites, with business elites who have been actually benefiting from rent-seeking positions, etc., from sort of completely broken fiscal system. So there is a need for reforming, I mean, Tunisian capitalism, I would say, and to rethink, I mean, the or to negotiate a fiscal reform, to negotiate with different social groups and economic groups, and this is not easy. Actually, many governments have been they tried, but it's the political configuration. It's so shaky, so uncertain, so fragile that it's clear that the governments and political elites are more interested into securing, stabilizing their situation, and not really acting actively towards social and economic reforms. Now, I do think that really, I mean, especially with the COVID crisis, which completely worsened the macroeconomic indicators with, I mean, unemployment, etc., etc. I mean, unemployment, poverty rates, I mean, high levels of debt, etc. I do think that today there is a need to elaborate or to strike a social and economic agreement. Now, the situation is completely different in Tunisia than Egypt. I mean, in Egypt, there is at some point a dictatorship able to govern through decrees, through an authoritative way. This is not the case in Tunisia, but governing through consensus is also tricky, is not obvious. So there is a need for all these economic actors and political actors to end this war of attrition they have been involved in, and to sit around maybe a table of negotiation to discuss really mutual concessions. And this is what actually some political actors and social and economic actors are currently discussing and trying really to implement on the ground. There are, of course, it's not easy. I mean, it wasn't easy in the past, and it won't be easy today. But I do think that there is a serious threat, really, when we see the trust in democracy, the trust in democratic institutions. That, I mean, the level of trust is at its lowest. And there is another game changer at some point that we saw it clearly in 2019 in the elections, which is the rise of radical groups and of populist groups, of some hybrid groups that are really will for sure, I mean, reshape the political landscape. They are threatening political parties, many political parties, and another, the Islamist party, is one of them, who have been actively playing an important and an active role in the transition since 2011. They are we see sort of weakening of all these parties, and the rise of more radical and populist parties. And of course, this is also another signal, another serious alarm that these elites, I mean, whether social, economic, or political elites, they have really now to come to the moment of truth and not delay the economic reforms anymore.
I believe we've lost contact with Yezid for the moment, so I'm going to take over briefly as moderator. And Dalia, I'd like to turn to you to talk about Algeria. So Algeria has, witnessed a major protest movement last year. But it seems that between activities that the regime did and the pandemic itself, that opposition has somehow quieted down or been absorbed. And so, I'm curious what you think. What's the current situation? What will we see in Algeria as one hopes the pandemic recedes? And what are the prospects for real change going forward?
Thank you, Michele. Yes, indeed. As you said, the Hirak was able to succeed in a few tangible and got some tangible results. But unfortunately, when you see the energy, or at least the energy that I felt in the streets of Algeria and Algiers in 2019, this massive crowds that have taken up to the street, and then you see the result, there is something missing. So the question is really why such a mass movement achieved so little, and how the regime was able to absorb this movement. I think the regime played on the two flows of the Hirak, which were impracticable demands and the absence of leadership. And the third element was that the regime strategy was pretty good because it self-restrained and used calibrated coercion. So the first element, with what many Algerians to whom I talk called unrealistic demands, for many Algerians and who participated in the Hirak, a key reason for the low success of the movement and for the ability of the regime to absorb it was its inability.
Okay, friends, I think I think there may be a power outage in Beirut, so we'll get Dalia back soon and be able to finish with Algeria. But for now, Fred, let me go back to you on Libya. There are a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. I'm just going to read them out to you, Fred. Do you believe there are risks of internal conflict within the GNA that could affect their ability to defend against a renewed LNA offensive? And then also another question, could you speak, Fred, on both the GNA leadership and Haftar's views on the US? Let's put aside, we're going to get back to US policy in a moment, but maybe you could answer the initial questions on the GNA.
Right, that's a great question. I briefly stated, I mean, the answer is yes on the GNA fragmentation. I mean, when you had this existential threat to Tripoli, the various factions, the various armed groups put aside their differences, they defended the capital. And then once that threat was removed, you've had those differences reemerge. You have immense jockeying now, personal rivalries within the GNA over appointments. You've got games being played. You've got rivalries within specific towns, like the powerhouse town of Misrata. You've got armed groups, dragging their feet on the ceasefire implementation because they're trying to accrue more, privileges. You have militias that have basically captured entire ministries. So I don't think we're on the brink of open street fighting in Tripoli. But again, I think if there were a conflict to arise in the Oil Crescent, which is obviously far removed from the capital, would you have a willing coalition of armed groups that would go to that location? I think that speaks to the other issue of the international, involvement, that the Turks have now put Syrian mercenaries on the ground, and that those foreign fighters could be deployed in a renewed conflict because perhaps of the unreliability of the fractious GNA coalition.
Michele, are you handing back to me now?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I mean, I just had the 4th electricity cut of the day here in Beirut, at least at, where I am, and I apologize to everyone. Dalia, is having her cut. Who wants her router reconnects. So we'll come back to her on Algeria. Now, I seem to have come back in just around when you were come back to Fred with questions on internal dynamics. I see Dalia's rejoined us.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. I believe you were addressing the first question. You started to answer,
Yes.
how the regime managed to survive.
Yes, so I was answering the first question of Michele, that was how the regime was able to absorb the political movement. So I was saying basically that the regime was able to absorb it because it played on the weaknesses of the Hirak itself, which are two. One, in realistic demands, and realistic between quotes. This is not a judgment. This is the interviewee to whom I talk who used that word. And the second thing is the lack of leadership. And the third element is the self-restraint of the security forces and the use of calibrated coercion. So these are, this is how the regime was able to absorb the Hirak. So regarding a key reason actually to explain why also the Hirak was unable to achieve such a mass movement, was unable to achieve, tangible result, is the inexistence of a workable goal, of a clear roadmap for the day after. Nobody actually thought about what can we do once Bouteflika will be out, and what do we really want, what can we really achieve. Moreover, there was no plan to keep protesters engaged and integrate them into the political process. So it is the Hirak that is actually showing today some signs, unfortunately, of vulnerability, with a serious, durable confrontation between troops. Today we have in the Hirak the first group with impracticable and infeasible demands, the Force du Pacte de l'Alternative Démocratique, forces of the Democratic Alternative Pact, who refuses any kind of discussion or negotiation with the authorities and call for a total dissolution of the system. And we have the second force, which is called Le Pôle Démocratique, the Democratic Pole, which calls for negotiating with the authorities to reach a consensus, and whose representative backed up the National Dialogue Commission that was dissolved since then. So the second elements that played in favor of the regime is the absence of leadership. As you may know, the movement refused to constitute itself, and it remained leaderless and of affiliation, with neither a hierarchy at every protest, as a matter of fact. So of kinds of leadership to their movement is very understandable, because these are people who understood that any kind of leadership might be co-opted, or might be marginalized, or simply jailed. So they refuse to institutionalize their movement. But again, change requires sustained political organizing. Collectivism, as we call it today, might be sufficient, to ignite and to ignite political energy, but infrastructures are needed to channel that energy and translate it into political process and into public policies. And collectivism is no longer enough. Unfortunately, the halted the demonstrations, and hence Algerians found themselves only able to be active on Twitter, on Facebook, and so on and so forth. The third element that made the regime also to absorb the Hirak, the popular movement, its behaved security forces. At the beginning, the regime sent pretty strong signs that it will intervene against any suspicious calls for mobilization in the name of democracy. But then it changed in its strategy. Why? Because this immediately placed the event in the dramatic and the traumatic historical frame that was Algiers, October 5th, 1988, crackdown on protesters. And so during these events, as we know, the army intervened and shot on sight. Some 500 youngsters were killed back then. And so in the following weeks, the regime, the authorities quickly came to understand that a crackdown would be a poor strategy, except on a few occasions, really, the police behaved calmly and with patience throughout the country and throughout 1 year of political protest. So for a year, violence from the security forces was an exception rather than the rule. Led protests vent their anger, seeded many parts of the city for demonstration, and La Grande Poste became a landmark for protesters. But President Tebboune himself validated their grievances and described their movement as blessed. So this is one of the important elements, in my view, that made the regime able to absorb the popular protests.
Okay, looks like I might be moderating again. Yezid might have dropped off again. And Dalia, I just want to ask you a follow-up question about Algeria while we have you, which is, you know, did the pandemic just press the pause button on protests? I mean, do you expect to see large-scale protest return? I understand what you said, that that's not necessarily the answer or the way for Algeria to move forward, but it seems like there's very much unfinished business in Algeria, but that as in many places of the world, that with the pandemic, people have, you know, have largely gone back inside. So do you think that's going to make a difference? I also wonder what you think the impact of the economic situation in Algeria and the way the pandemic has kind of accelerated this what I would say is the looming end of the oil and gas era, or, you know, created a real glut in oil and gas supplies. How's this going to affect the situation in Algeria as we look at the next year, 2 years?
Yes, Michele. For sure, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic halted the demonstration and the popular movement because, you know, people realized after a few weeks of the beginning of the pandemic that that was a serious threat, serious security and health threat rather than a dirty political trick, because this is what millions of Algerians believed at the beginning. They thought that it was a dirty political trick for the regime to stop the demonstration. And then they understood. But I think the movement has shown in general its mobilization potential, raised awareness and changed public opinion nationwide and internationally about how Algerians are in 2020, what Algerians are expecting from their government. However, it could not action any genuine institutional changes for now and impact the electoral process, because let us remember here that the presidential election, despite its cancellation twice, happened on December 12, 2019, and also a referendum on the new constitution happened on November 1st, 2020. So that means that the regime continue to do whatever it would take, it took for it to survive. And of course, you know, it is very hard to imagine the day after what is going to happen to these millions of Algerians who demonstrated. Are they going to come back in the street? Are they going, you know, after the end of the COVID, to have the same mobilization potential again? And this leads us to your question, which is the economic question. I think Algeria was hurt already before the COVID-19 pandemic. The economic, situation in Algeria was already back before the COVID-19. What the COVID-19 did is it exacerbated the socio-economic problem. So what I suspect is that while the first wave, if I may say, of the Hirak has been pretty political, when we had Algerians taken up to the street asking for the end of the Bouteflika era, his exit, and for a civilian state, not a military one. I believe that the second episode, the second season of the Hirak is going also to ask for socio-economic reforms, because the social question is going to be at the heart of the Hirak because of this bad economic situation. As you may know, many Arab and African states looked to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for assistance to help counter the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic. But Algeria and Tebboune refused to do so. This is due to mainly the crisis, of the 90s and the trauma of the 90s, because for Algerian authorities and for the Algerian people, there is a trauma with the, le plan d'ajustement structurel of the 90s. But what is the other solution? We do know from a fact that, from the figures that we have, that the exchange reserve are depleted, and the Algerian authorities, unfortunately, misused the surplus that they have accumulated during the 2000, and overspending without clear priorities in an effort to buy social peace and to keep their patronage network. And so growing anger at the regime and the failure of its successive government to diversify the economy gave rise to the Hirak in 2019. But I want to say that the same reason that led millions of Algerians to go to the street to demonstrate are still here today. And I believe that the economic situation is going to worsen. And so I would say, once the Hirak again takes to the street after lockdown measures are lifted, the regime will struggle with greater unrest. The government has no more fiscal room left to transform the structure of Algeria's economy, diversify its productive sector, and increase its competitiveness. And hence, the upcoming months are going really to be very challenging for the Algerian economy, for the Algerian people, but also and especially for the Algerian regime.
Thanks, Dalia. Since I'm back after the fifth power cut of the day, and I hope there won't be any others before we finish this panel, I want to go back to another round in which I'm going to shift the focus much more to foreign policy, while still allowing you the chance to come in on other dimensions, and also so that we can bring in a bit of discussion of Morocco. And I've been looking at the comments box here and looking at questions we're receiving from our audience. So I'm integrating that into some of the questions I'm putting to you. Fred, I'm going to go back to Libya, start with you. And I may have missed a bit of this when I was, enjoying the power cut. And you may have spoken a little bit about the agency of Libyans. I mean, you've said quite a bit about the dynamics, about the local dynamics among Libyan parties. But I guess what I still don't get a sense of, or I'd like to get more of a sense of, is how, given how much investment there is by external powers, how much external powers are playing out their own rivalries in Libya, but rivalries that extend well beyond Libya as well. Does that mean that that there's almost nothing the Libyans can do to minimize the impact of external power rivalry? And given their own divisions, of course, are they sort of condemned to endlessly play this game? Do they have some real agency, whether that's the UN brokered talks or some other channel? And then I'm going to ask you to pull out, and I'll come to the others with the same sort of question, which is pretty much, what can these countries expect from the new US administration, from President Biden? And does that alter potentially how other major powers such as France and President Macron may approach these countries? Because clearly when it comes to Libya and Egypt, but of course Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco, these two external powers are really major, along with the EU here and there, Russia, potentially China in some cases. So start with you, Fred, first on the Libyan agency aspect, and then if you zoom out, and I'll carry on looking at that foreign policy angle with everyone else.
Yeah, great question, Yezid. So I think this notion of Libya as an arena for regional power rivalries is absolutely valid, and it goes back to the 2011 revolution, where you had contending foreign backers even then, right? And so those regional rivalries were latent for a while. They really exploded after 2014, and of course the most obvious one is the Emirati bloc versus the Turkish Qatari bloc, and these are deep rivalries over visions for regional order, economics, ideology, Islamism. I think these are well known, and so you do have a sense in Libya that there's a sense of victimization, and especially after these warring foreign powers deploy their own military forces on the ground. You got the sense, and I was in Libya in January of this year, you talk to ordinary Libyans, they say, look, the fate of our country is not in our hands. It's being decided in Ankara, Moscow, Abu Dhabi, Berlin. And there's a lot of truth to that. For instance, when Turkey deployed these Syrian mercenaries, I talked to GNA armed commanders, and they said, look, we don't want these foreign infantry guys. And the Turkish response is, tough luck. And so in the fighting that has ensued, the foreign powers have cut out the Libyans in terms of targeting, deployment. They've got their own drones, their own foreign forces on the ground, and that gives them enormous leverage. And now, as I mentioned, they're occupying key strategic sites, military bases. The Russians are in oil installations, so they've got leverage over the economic assets. However, and I want to caveat something, the Libyans still do have agency, and it's a negative form of agency, right? They can spoil, they can frustrate the demands of their patrons. You've had various people walk out of meetings. Haftar is famous for this. Various foreign powers expect him to do something, and he frustrates their demands. You have a lot of frustration, obviously, from the Russians who've soured on Haftar. The Egyptians are trying to contain him. They're opening lines to other Libyan, actors. The Turks have been frustrated with the GNA, and much of this has to do with fragmentation, right? These foreign powers are confronted with a very hyper-local, fragmented power structure. They don't know the right, buttons to push. And so I do think, Libyans still have some agency. They're also very adept at playing foreign powers off against each other, right? You've had the GNA now opening a line to France. You've had Haftar maneuvering between different powers. And so this is a game that they've played. I want to end on something related to international mediation. What you've had international mediators say, the line that they're telling Libyans, is that unless you bridge your differences, right, unless you make peace among yourselves, you're not going to have a country that's your own. The foreigners are going to be in the driver's seat. And so the international mediators are trying to appeal to Libyan nationalism, xenophobia, that, there's a window now that you got to act on it, or else you're going to surrender your sovereignty. That's fine, right? But we have to remember, and I'll end on this, there are Libyan elites that benefit from that foreign patronage, right? And they have no qualms about selling out their country because they're enjoying that foreign support.
That's a hugely important point to end on there. But now let's move on and pull in this other really important actor, which so far has been pretty absent, and that's the US administration. Clearly, the US could do a lot for bad and for good. And the US role in Libya has been quite pivotal, starting with 2011, backing the NATO involvement, and then pulling back, of course, in the last few years. Will that change the overall picture? Will it change the behavior of the other competing regional powers and, well, external powers? But could it play into these internal dynamics and elite dynamics you've just mentioned in a way that might, mitigate, soften, improve?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, absolutely, the U.S. has a huge role. It did pull back. When you talk to Libyans, I think they sometimes exaggerate the influence of the U.S. to solve this issue. But I think at the very least, and moving forward to the Biden administration, under Trump, it was an incredibly negative type of role related to his impulsive signaling and his deference to a particular bloc of Arab autocrats who were acting in Libya, obviously Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, who felt emboldened, obviously, by personal phone calls. And so, I think under Biden, you'll have a pulling back of that. You'll have more process. I don't know that Biden will want to own Libya, given the competing priorities. But I want to emphasize, even a very minimal diplomatic investment by the United States could have a qualitative effect in terms of signaling, in terms of convening and building consensus. I think the U.S. has enormous convening power, obviously among its regional allies like Egypt and the Emirates. It's unclear to me if the Biden administration is going to want to penalize spoilers like the United Arab Emirates, because it may perceive that it needs the Emirates on other regional priorities. Obviously, the Abraham Accords, you've got Iran, and so there's always been a triaging, right, of priorities when it comes to Libya. And unfortunately, Libya has ranked fairly low. It's not deemed as absolutely essential in the U.S. interest, and so you've had these other regional states feeling emboldened that they can just maneuver and play their games. You do have other actors besides the the executive branch in the United States. Congress is taking a hard look at Libya and regional spoilers. There's the Libya Stabilization Act that passed in the House, and this, I think, could send a signal to foreign interveners. I want to believe that the U.S. can play a role. I think especially in tempering the European disunity, right? The Europeans have been very fragmented on Libya, and the French, I think, have been allowed to play an unhelpful role. And part of that is a function of broken transatlantic relations. And so if the U.S. were to backstop more of European diplomacy, I think that might also have a signaling effect. But just to conclude, we shouldn't raise our expectations too much. The U.S. has always viewed Libya through the lens of something else. Obviously, for a while, it was counterterrorism, and the terrorist threat has diminished significantly. The U.S. can conduct counterterrorism operations in Libya right now, regardless of working through local proxies or regardless if there's a unified government. And so I guess bottom line, modest optimism, but we shouldn't get our hopes up too much.
Thanks, Libya. Thanks, Fred, on Libya. Michele, I mean, clearly one of the other major actors in Libya is Egypt. And Egypt's own relationships with both the U.S. administration and the French presidency, have always been really important. Well, certainly with France, very important since President Sisi's visit to Paris, which provoked quite a lot of unhappiness here and there. The award of the Légion d'honneur medal to Sisi in a rather odd manner, where there's almost no publicity about it, and then a sort of justification that, oh well, it's we give the medal to all visiting presidents and heads of state, which I'm told is not actually true. But regardless of the the specifics of this particular visit, it looks like Sisi has won and is retaining a lot of international recognition of his administration, of his policies, which includes effectively not just on Libya, but also at home. And can Sisi, in fact, continue to count on this level of US support, calculating, for instance, that the Egyptian presidency has seen many US presidents come and go. There are those who've emphasized human rights. There have been mild penalties from the Obama administration after 2013 and the coup d'etat. Should Sisi worry at all, really?
Well, first of all, to give President Sisi his due, I think that building a pretty solid wall of international support for his regime has been one of his successes. He does, of course, have a few enemies, Turkey, Qatar in particular, but In terms of the major international powers, Sisi has built a lot of support and has diversified support. And this is how he's done it. In an odd way, he has played on both Egypt's strengths and its weaknesses to get international support. I mentioned already that he's gone on an enormous arms spending spree. Most of those arms sales, or arms purchases have come from Europe, from France in particular, but Germany and Italy and Britain and to a lesser degree, Russia as well. And then, of course, he continues to buy U.S. arms with the assistance that's provided to him from the United States, from American taxpayers. So there have been the arms purchases, but then there's also the indebtedness. And in an odd way, I think that Sisi has gotten the international community to invest in him by loaning to Egypt. I mean, he's now borrowed $20 billion from the IMF over the last 5 years, including significant loans this year. About a third of that was this year alone. And then there will be more because Egypt needs at least $10 billion of external financing every single year to meet its costs. And so this is, Sisi has sort of bound, those in the international community to himself. And he has a military and commercial relationship with Russia, a development relationship with China, and so forth. So all of these are, they are sources of strength for Sisi, to some extent. Now, you asked about the United States. So what's changing here? Now, first of all, let me say what's not going to change is that no one in the international community, none of these allies want to destabilize Egypt. And they all, including the United States, I think, fear the consequences of instability in Egypt. In particular, Western Europeans fear instability of Egypt because they fear mass migration either from Egypt or through Egypt from the rest of the African continent, as well as the possibility of terrorism in Europe. So no one wants to destabilize Egypt. And that will be true of the incoming administration of President-elect Biden as well. There's no desire to destabilize Egypt. At the same time, it's going to be a different climate for Sisi. Sisi had in President Trump a special friend in the White House who did special favors for him, many of them. I don't think he's going to have that in President Biden. I think there's not a personal relationship that I'm aware of between Biden and Sisi of any significance. And anyway, I just don't think President-elect Biden is going to do policy the way that Trump has done with all these sort of special deals and special favors. Fred used the word process for the Biden administration, and I think that's true. I think there will be a return of kind of the normal American national security policy-making process, national security interests, rather than personal interests, at the center of this. And I do think, there will be some questions. There are questions. I think there have been increasing questions in the U.S. Congress, as well as in some quarters of the administration about, exactly how valuable is this relationship with Egypt. As I said, nobody wants to destabilize the country, but will the same level of aid continue? Will the same level of political and diplomatic support to Egypt and frankly to the military rule in Egypt continue under the Biden administration? I don't know. We have yet to see. And I just want to add, Yezid, that there are some very big policy questions that the Biden administration faces in this region. Of course, there's the question of Iran and, how to handle somehow, getting back into an agreement to contain Iran's nuclear program. Egypt's not a major player in that, by the way, and Iran's not a major concern for Egypt. But there's something else, which is, I think the Biden administration, as with the Trump and the Obama administrations before it, is going to want to continue to find ways to diminish U.S. military presence and military involvement in the Middle East. And the question is how to do that. The argument that's being put forward, by many, and I would say with the United Arab Emirates in the lead, is this means that the United States should transfer very sophisticated arms to its allies in the Middle East. And we see the Trump administration putting forward a package for the UAE. There's a question as to how this will go and whether the Biden administration will accept that logic or whether they will slow it down, because the arms that have been transferred in the past are used not only for these countries to defend themselves, but to intervene in each other's affairs, notably the UAE intervening in Libya, Egypt intervening in Libya to some extent, Yemen, etc. And so all of these big policy questions, particularly as to how the United States sort of reconfigures its presence and its involvement in the region, are going to affect policies toward Egypt and Libya in particular.
Thanks, Michele. I'm very pleased you ended on Libya and Egypt and the military dimension of the US relationship, because we've just had a question in about whether Egypt might act to enforce the Jufra-Sirte line in Libya. If you could speak quite briefly on that, just to give us a sense of whether Egypt, clearly faces a balance of, on the one hand, being maybe emboldened enough to intervene, but it wouldn't do that unless it really felt that was necessary. So what's your sort of quick 1 minute on that?
Well, I'll say something quickly about it, but I'd love to hear what Fred would say as well. Look, Egypt has legitimate security concerns about Libya. It's a very long border, very difficult to police. We have seen in the past arms coming across, militants coming across into Egypt. So Egypt has legitimate security concerns. At the same time, I think Egypt's capabilities of doing that kind of an action are limited, and it certainly wouldn't want to be unsuccessful. That would be a big problem for Egypt, both in terms of its border security as well as even internally in Egypt. In the Egyptian military, they don't like to try to project power a lot because they don't want to be exposed as being not as strong as they want to appear. But I'd be curious to hear what Fred thinks will happen.
Yes, Fred, please.
Yeah, just to add to that, I don't think they want to be dragged into a quagmire. There are issues of logistics, their own capability. They were never a fan of Haftar's attack on Tripoli last year. Of course, they supported Haftar as a local client on their border for border security, but they've since soured on him. Again, they're trying to keep him in a box. I've been told that there's sort of a new pragmatic trend in Egyptian leadership on the Libyan file from the intelligence service, and Egypt has shown a willingness to engage with Turkey and sort of de-escalate, and so maybe a nominal deployment to that area, but again, I don't think they want to get dragged in. They don't. It's not in their interest to see a massive outbreak of conflict, and as I've said, they're souring on Haftar. They've already soured on him. They're looking, for a way out of this.
Thanks, Fred. So Tunisia, Hamza, these foreign relationships, how critical are they? Do they? Starting with the military dimension, the security assistance, American military and security assistance to Tunisia over the past few years has escalated enormously, French and European as well. And there's clearly a huge investment in that. Does this come at the expense of in helping the Tunisian economy, help the Tunisian government meet these social and economic expectations we discussed right at the start? Does it push it in ways that lead to maybe polarization in the country? And all of this, of course, ties into finally Tunisia's relationships with Algeria on the one side, with Libya on the other, where, clearly from Libya, there have been all sorts of threats and risks to Tunisia with the escalation of the risk of direct regional and international clashes inside Libya. So it's an increasingly complex environment that Tunisia has never had to face before, I think. Maybe I'm wrong and you'll correct me, but how do you see this complex, and specifically whether the new US administration and a sort of more activist French presidency, how does that really drive things forward for Tunisia?
Yeah, actually, I mean, your question is really good, Yezid, in the sense that security since 2013 and 14 has become one of the top priority, really, of the international cooperation between Tunisia and the international community, especially Europe and the US, as you mentioned. Of course, I mean the situation of Libya is played an important role in this. The fact, I mean, the fear of a spillover of the Libyan conflict, the border issues and border insecurity, is a major driver for the international cooperation. The need as well to strengthen the capacities of the Tunisian military in especially shaky and uncertain regional environments. So what I mean, these are really, I mean, the causes or the what explain the increase in the support on the security side for Tunisia from the international community. Now, what we have observed on the ground is this. The counter effect at some point, or this backsliding effect of this of the heavy-handed security approach, or securitization, of course, of the border regions of the south, especially. I mean, these are regions that have been suffering from neglect for decades. There is a huge lack of investment, public investment, and major problems when it comes to infrastructure, etc. So there is a need as well, I mean, to think about developing these regions, about thinking of alternatives and revenue creation activities for the communities who used to rely on cross-border trade and smuggling, etc. So this is at some point one of the major concern or that went, or they have been going, I mean, hand in hand with the security, the strengthening of the security measures on the borders. As you mentioned, I mean, Libya is very important for Tunisia. I mean, it's one of, it used to be one of the major partners, economic partners and trade partners for Tunisia. And with the situation in Libya, I mean, Tunisia lost an important partner. This situation in Algeria is not really. I mean, the cooperation is in terms of security and military cooperation is good. I mean, there is a strong cooperation on border policing, etc., on both sides of the border. But when it comes to developing the long neglected regions on the northwest and center-west Tunisia, I mean, there is I mean, a lot has to be done on that side as well. So it seems like, you know, really Tunisia is getting isolated. There is a need for strong regional integration with neighbors, but neighbors are going themselves through, I mean, tough challenges. And of course, it seems also, and it's clear that the heavy investment on security is also made at the expense of more maybe investment from the international community on development, on infrastructure, etc. There is an important focus, which is understandable, I mean, on security, but it should be really, and this is clearly this is obvious, I mean, on the especially in the south and in the border regions, to promote as well, I mean, public investments and to think really of the involvement of international community in financing investments, etc., in these regions. So yeah, this is basically this conundrum or this dilemma at some point between economy and security is here, and Tunisia has been really struggling for a while now on how really to strike a good balance on security and development. And I do think that the international community has to play a role on this. The heavy investment on security is really not really shouldn't be the only and sole answer to the complex challenges many regions of the country have been facing.
Thanks, Hamza. That was, I think, a very rich response. I'm going to come back to you because we're getting questions on some of the more sort of domestic issues again. So I'll hope to come back in a final round of questions a little bit later on. But first, I want to move to Algeria and put almost exactly the same question to Dalia, where, French and US relationships with Algeria have been far more important, I think, than many people recognize, because Algeria has such a strong sort of discourse of independence and autonomy, of anti-colonialism, the whole legacy. And yet it's very clear that these subtle, sort of rather subtly presented relationships are actually very important for the ruling political order. How do you see that going forward? I mean, where are we really today in Algeria? How much does the domestic dynamic, the regime survival you discussed earlier on, how tied into these foreign relationships is that? Dalia, I think you're muted.
Sorry. When it comes to the United States, there was a rapprochement between Algeria and the United States, a remarkable one, as a matter of fact, since 9/11, when the United States discovered that North African country that has been fighting between quotes terrorism for a decade, and that has something of expertise and experience to offer. And so there was a cooperation in the military security domain, and it has been outstanding, as a matter of fact, especially that we are talking here about a country that has one of the strongest military in the region after Egypt, but it is a country that has experience in the fight against terrorism, and hence the United States find that ally in the Sahel. Let us remember here that the Sahel is a real quagmire for Algeria and for the region, and Algeria is sharing more than 6,500 kilometers with 7 other different countries, and it found itself most of the time single-handed in the fight against terror. And so the Americans find this ally that has experience, that has knowledge, and that is able or willing to a certain extent to cooperate. But again, the last move of I want to say, desperate move of President Trump, who clearly, is desperate of coup d'éclat made towards Morocco against the Polisario Front and the Western Sahara, is or might complicate this relationship. Now the question, and I don't want to speculate here, I think we need to wait to answer this question once Biden will take office, and we will see whether the administration of Biden will reverse the decision on Western Sahara or no. And then we can see what Algeria and how Algeria will react. But again, this is not France. This is not the European Union. This, is a cooperation that is security and military military. There isn't that much, economic ties by comparison with Europe. But one thing remains sure, and one thing is in common between both Europe and the United States, is the desire of both not to destabilize the North African behemoth that is Algeria. And so I think that both are going, to make efforts to make the status quo endure as much as possible. And as you said it, and Michele said it, when we have a French president offering the Légion d'honneur for a dictator like Sisi, I doubt that if, for instance, coercive measures are used in Algeria against peaceful process, France or Macron is going to have any reaction. Again, they have no interest whatsoever in destabilizing the country, and they want the regime to continue as long as possible.
Thanks, Dalia. I thought for a second there I'd lost you. So Morocco, I'd like to spend a few minutes on Morocco. I've not got into the domestic politics, but here's where I think we can look a little bit at, since Algeria is involved in this as well, all of North Africa, the West Sahara thing, the reactivation of that conflict, and of course also the normalization of ties between Morocco and Israel. Again, another sort of Trump wildcard, potentially causing more trouble than benefits in terms of Algerian public opinion, for instance, in terms, of course, clearly of more trouble in Western Sahara for Morocco, which isn't necessarily good, and implications potentially for Morocco's wider foreign policy in Africa and elsewhere. So, I mean, for me, this is a bit of a jumble, and I'm not sure what really is important in this picture and what is maybe just a distraction. Hamza, I'll come to you first, if you could, maybe Dalia very quickly afterwards, and then I'd like to have a couple of minutes for final comments in response to some of the comments we've received from our viewers. Hamza.
Well, I do think that it's an opportunistic move from Morocco. Actually, it seems like Morocco wanted or to gain a greater advantage on in the Western Sahara conflict. I mean, the international community is so busy with the COVID, and there is a sort of fatigue, and I mean, among the international community on this long-running conflict. I mean, and I do think that Moroccan also, they saw in November, after this skirmish between Moroccan, armed forces and the Polisario forces, I mean, at the Moroccan-Mauritanian border, that the support of the EU and France was not really a frank support, was not really warm support. EU and France, they were cautious. I mean, so I do think that they tried really to jump into and to take to play this Trump wildcard and to get the support of Morocco on this on the issue of the Western Sahara, which is, by the way, I mean, it's an important issue. It's important to recall that it's an important issue for the Moroccan regime, for the Moroccan kingdom, I mean, but also for a big part of the Moroccan people. Really, this is a cause unifying the Moroccans at some point, and the fact or the support of many parties, like the PJD, for example, and many political parties for this move, shows that the regime was not in fear of delegitimization at some point. So I do think that the move was opportunistic and based on a sort of calculation on what to lose and what to gain. And it's clear that the support of the U.S. administration, even if this administration is leaving and it's about to leave, was understood and perceived in Morocco like an important one to get to really strengthen its position on the Western Saharan conflict.
Dalia, would you like to come in as well?
Yes, very quickly. I think, again, as I said, and I think we don't repeat it enough, of course, the Moroccan kingdom has stake in this story, and it's been going on since the 70s, and Algeria, but also Mauritania have a stake in this. But the first victim of this desperate move by a president who doesn't want to recognize that he lost are the Sahrawi people. And these are the first victims. And so they've been thrown under the bus, excuse my French, by a president who has a few days to go and who didn't know what to do to keep attention. And so the first victim, again, are the Sahrawi people. Now, this is of course, as you asked me, Yezid, whether the Algerian government reacted. Not really, but I guess no reaction is also a reaction. I think the Algerian regime is waiting for Joe Biden to take over and then to see whether the decision would be reversed or no. And very quickly, for the Algerian people, there are two causes that are very sacred to their heart. The first one is the Palestinian cause, and the second one is the Western Sahara cause. So this is still a cause that interests many Algerians who are, still standing with the Sahrawi for their desire for independence.
Many thanks. So now I'm going to come to everyone for final comments, if you've got anything to add, but I'm going to direct Michele and Hamza on two very specific comments we've had from our viewers. Michele, the arrest and then release of the three members of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights recently, which caused a lot of international response, and the Egyptian authorities seem to have retreated, and by releasing these three members rather sooner than some people expected. How do you read that? Is this, does this tie into the whole expectation of testing U.S. administration of the Biden presidency? And Hamza, Tunisia started the Arab Spring. Any chance that if there are failed expectations once again in Tunisia, we're looking at another Arab Spring starting in Tunisia, another uprising?
Yezid, on the question regarding the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights activists, look, we've seen some really confusing moves out of Egypt, releasing some people and then imprisoning these very, very prominent human rights activists who hadn't been taken before and then letting them go. And let me just say this, the Egyptian regime under Sisi has been imprisoning a lot of people these are prisoners of conscience for their political views, for their work and human rights, civil society, media. It's one of the biggest jailers of journalists in the world. And some of them have been foreign citizens, including American citizens or family members of Americans, especially Egyptian Americans who are active in civil society. So, there's some of these arrests are about repression and sending signals within Egypt. And some of them seem to be, frankly, a form of hostage taking that the Egyptian regime uses for bargaining. And I have to say that I really think that there's increasing cynicism about this abroad, and that really now in the US government, and I imagine in other governments like the government of France that has major problems with this, the government of Italy that's been trying to deal with the Giulia Regeni killing, they're just getting really kind of sick of these tactics on the part of Sisi. So it'll be interesting to see if there will be a different approach. One thing I think there will be with the Biden administration, as one of our colleagues at Carnegie says, there's going to be an end to the values holiday of the Trump administration in foreign policy.
Thanks, Michele. And Hamza, over to you immediately.
Yeah, it's a good question. Now, I do think that, the democratic settings and democratic regimes or pluralistic settings are resilient. We can imagine a deep political crisis. We can imagine social unrest. But now an uprising, it's really not in the on the agenda or is not expected, simply because the responsibility is collective. There is a collective responsibility on the situation Tunisia is living today and going through today. And of course, I do think that we might see anticipated elections. We might see some political fixes or political maneuvers to try to really to address some of the claims and demands of the popular claims and demands. So we can expect probably maybe next year or the year after, early elections, but not in case really of a deep and entrenched political and social crisis.
Thanks, Hamza. Now I'm going to wrap up, unfortunately. I first want to sort of summarize looking forward at North Africa, and as for everywhere else in the world, we're still not out of the COVID pandemic, and these social and economic challenges and public finance challenges facing all countries in North Africa are enormous, and deepen existing problems that have been, emerging over the past 20 years or so. And so clearly, governments throughout this region, which already struggled to provide basic social services and economic investment, and to stabilize their politics, therefore, and maintain their domestic coalitions, all these governments are going to struggle even more post-COVID, because definitely the long-term impacts on every possible level are going to be are going to be long-term indeed, and where we can't expect economic recovery and rebound that happens in, say, more advanced economies will not necessarily automatically translate into the same level of recovery or pace of recovery in North African countries. So the impact of where we're looking at post-COVID on pre-existing problems of governance and on armed conflict and on adventurism by regional and international powers in the North Africa sphere, clearly this is something that still poses a huge challenge for governments and for local society. Now, in thanking everyone for taking part, to the panelists, to my colleagues, and to all those who took part in listening and sending us comments, I want to remind you that there's the final panel of this annual conference starts in, I guess, just under half an hour. And this is on Lebanon in 2021, a year of existential challenges. And for those of you who were with us the last 90 minutes or so, you had a demonstration of the little challenges people like Dalia and I face with the power cuts 2 or 3 times during the course of this one panel. So please tune in under half an hour for that final panel. Thanks again.